Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. I'm your host, Alan Miller. We have a first-time guest today. His name is not a household word in terms of the population, but if you're talking about cardiology and you're talking about cardiovascular disease, the name J. Cohn is known to any doctor throughout the world. And it's really exciting to have him here today, talk about his new book and cardiovascular disease. Jay, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, your new book, which I'll hold up shortly and show, is not your first book and not really one of many books. What's different about cardiovascular health, which has just come out?
Well, my mission was to explain to the public what cardiovascular disease is all about and to question the version that they're receiving from the media and from the healthcare agencies, which I think is misleading them a bit and leading to a misunderstanding of what causes cardiovascular disease, what causes it to progress, what causes heart attacks and strokes, and what one could do about it beyond what is being advocated in the public media.
Now, by way of background, you went to Union College in New York.
I did.
And Cornell Medical School, and trace your career after that.
Well, I trained in Boston at the Beth Israel Hospital, and then went to Georgetown to do some research for a few years, and then stayed there as professor of medicine at Georgetown University for about 14 years, and then was recruited to Minnesota to direct the cardiovascular division at the university in 1974. I had a 5-year plan. I thought I would be here for about 5 years, and you can see how long I've been here. It's now 43 years.
So something went awry with your planning at that point.
That's right.
Now, the U certainly has been a cutting-edge hospital, medical school for many, many scientific endeavors. The first heart implant, I believe, was at the U, and a lot of other things have come out of the U. Talk about the progression of the cardio section, the cardiovascular department.
Well, when I arrived, as was true in many institutions, cardiology was kind of a small division, had a few doctors that saw patients. There wasn't much research going on at the university, but it was a fine institution with quality care. We evolved it into a research institution with a growing faculty of young clinical scientists who were dedicated not only to patient care, but to research and gaining new insights into cardiovascular disease. And we sort of initiated most of the work that's been done since then in heart failure, which was my focus of interest in those days. And we trained individuals who've gone all over the world in leading cardiology programs in other institutions. So it was really a growth industry when I came here, and we built it into what I hope will long remain a powerhouse of cardiovascular clinical and research activities.
And when you say some of your students have gone all over the world, I know that you also have lectured and taught literally all over the world. You are certainly a very sought out expert on cardiovascular disease, and I think somehow or other you have transformed the department into the Rasmussen Clinic, and tell us about that.
Well, when I stepped down, I was director of the division for 22 years, which is unheard of today. People burn out running programs like that. In those days, it was possible. And when I stepped down in 1996, I came to the recognition that we were spending all of our resources taking care of end-stage disease, very sick people. And we had devised strategies for treatment, including heart transplant, which salvaged the lives of people who were otherwise going to die. And it was at that point a mission of great effort to keep people alive, and we thought we were doing great good for humanity. And I came to the realization that most of those people had disease which could have been prevented had it been recognized earlier. So I transitioned from managing and focusing on end-stage disease to attempting to identify early disease and developing methods that could slow its progression so that people could live healthily until their 9th or 10th decade of life without having a heart attack or a stroke. And to me, that is the mission for healthcare in the 21st century. It is to keep people healthy, not to devise more and more expensive methods to keep sick people alive.
And I know along that path, you have both patented some devices, and you hold patents on both, I guess, not only devices, but also, I would say, serums or...
Well, diagnostic tests are the things that we have been focusing on in recent years, and I have a number of patents on diagnostic methods for identifying people with early disease and for efforts to treat them to protect them from progression of the disease. So it is a shift in focus, and I'm confident that this is going to become the focus of healthcare in the 21st century. It hasn't been up until now. We live in a system where disease leads to reimbursement, and reimbursement leads to enthusiasm and lots of efforts to provide more and more treatment strategies which will generate a lot of revenue. And it'll require a single payer system, which I know you're sensitive to, in order to emphasize the importance of prevention. Because if you can reduce healthcare costs by keeping people healthy, you have a profound effect on the financial resources of the country. If you focus only on taking care of end-stage disease which is very expensive, you generate the revenue for the healthcare providers and for industry, but you're costing the country lots of money in healthcare.
Yeah, I have a real problem with the fact that the insurance industry makes so much money and/or profit, as well as pharmaceutical companies. And I know that research and development is important, but sometimes the result are unconscionable prices. I look at the other 138 civilized nations around the world, and I realize they have found systems that are cost effective. Here, we have profit-driven systems, and I just think it's ludicrous that the nation's health should hang in the balance of the bottom line.
Well, you're right, of course, and we're now in the throes of this revision of the healthcare system with a plan that will probably throw many people off out of healthcare and out of insurance and destine them to illness and premature death, which should not be even countenanced in the current era in a country like the United States.
Or, as Dr. Ron Paul said some years ago, the father of Dr. Rand Paul, what do you do with these people if they can't afford treatment? And he said, ultimately, you let them die, which is pretty frightening.
It is frightening. It's certainly lack of understanding of what a country is supposed to be doing for its citizens.
Okay, so we got to this point. This is not your first book.
No?
And let me take it and hold it up so it can be readily seen. We'll do a close-up on it. Cardiovascular health, how conventional wisdom is failing us. And obviously the motivation for the book is just as you told us, really prevention and keeping people alive. And I understand that the initial reviews have been overwhelming. And when I say overwhelming, I mean positive. I've read a couple of them, and they certainly from experts. But now you just got one that you just told me about before the show from what institution or what company?
It's from Booklist, which is the standard online review service for books. So it's whoever wrote it, I don't know. It's a commercial enterprise that doesn't utilize friends or colleagues. And they claimed they were blown away by the concept in the book because it is so non-traditional. And it just reflects how willingly the medical profession has gone along with the mantra that diet and exercise is the cause of heart disease, the lack of good diet and the lack of exercise is the cause of heart disease, and that the treatment is to exercise and diet and lose weight. And although those are nice missions and they have favorable effects on quality of life, they really are not fundamentally at fault in the mechanism of cardiovascular disease. And the country and the public is not being properly informed because they are then become hesitant to do the things that really need to be done, and instead are focusing on minor issues that may slightly affect the rate at which disease progresses, but are not fundamental to the biological process, which is largely inherited. So people know whether they have a family history of cardiovascular disease.
And that affects, certainly.
And that's the major contributor. Now, as we all recognize, knowing a little bit about genetics, that just because your father had a heart attack doesn't mean you've inherited the likelihood of having a heart attack.
Which my father did at 55.
Yes, and it doesn't mean you've inherited that. We all recognize that inheritance is complex, and everyone has a unique genome, which makes them uniquely at risk, not at risk because of a father or a brother or a sister. But it is true that the likelihood of disease is higher in individuals with a strong family history, and it is lower in individuals in whom there is no disease in their family, but it is never zero or never 100%.
Yeah, it's interesting because in my personal history, my mother was one of 12, most of whom lived into their 90s and did not die because of coronary problems, a variety of other problems. I only know of one who actually had a heart attack,
Right.
and that was responsible for his death. And yet my father's family, all in their 50s, had coronary problems.
Right.
But my grandfather, his father, lived well into his 80s and never had any heart problems.
So you have a piece of your genome which may have come from a grandfather that is healthy rather than from your father who had a problem. Your father may have picked up some of that genes from his mother rather than from his father. You know the complexity of this whole thing. And the fact of the matter is, you can go get your genome tested these days, and there's now all these commercial laboratories that encourage you to send in a specimen so that they can analyze your genome and tell you what your likelihood is having disease. And people often think that this is a very personal approach to understanding your risk. But again, it's a statistical likelihood because the genomic background is not adequate to identify precisely whether you have disease. It's only a % likelihood unless you have a specific single gene disease, and there are a handful of those, but cardiovascular disease is not one of them. So you only have that statistical likelihood, and the important thing is knowing in any individual whether they are at risk and have the early disease which is likely to progress or they do not. And in the United States, 50% of adults will die or be disabled by a cardiovascular event. So it isn't uncommon, it's half the population. But the problem is individuals don't know which half they're in. And I'd like to be able to tell them which half they're in.
Well, you developed
so if they know how, they know what to do about it.
a whole series of tests
Yes.
at the Rasmussen Institute. So tell us
Right.
about those.
Well, what we've devised, and this is one of my patents actually, what we've devised is a series of 10 tests that can be done in 1 hour in one room by one technologist that assess the health of your arteries and of your heart. And all morbid events, we call them morbid events, and they're like heart attacks, they're strokes, they're heart failure, they may even be kidney failure or sudden death. These are all blood vessel related events. And by studying the health of the large arteries, the small arteries, and the pumping chamber of the heart, we can identify abnormalities that may progress. And in the absence of abnormalities, there is no possibility of having a morbid event. If your arteries are healthy, you can't have a heart attack and you can't have a stroke. Those abnormalities are identifiable many years before the actual event takes place. So if we find them early enough, if we study someone 45 years old, and they have evidence for disease in their arteries that we suspect will progress, and we get them on treatment which we think is effective in slowing its progression. The goal is to slow the progression adequately so that that individual reaches age 90 or 100 without a morbid event, and I think that's possible. Leaving them alone, if they're 45, might mean a heart attack at 60 or 65, which is, to me, unacceptable and preventable.
So what you're doing is you're identifying the symptoms, and then I take it.
Not a symptom, it's a sign. It's
The signs.
They have no symptoms. These people are all healthy. They think they're healthy.
And once you identify it, you recommend treatment or change in lifestyle,
Well,
or
both.
just what?
Both. Certainly if it's very early disease and we think they have some trait that could be could undergo major correction. Suppose they're very fat and they eat a terrible diet, and we say, look, this is do or die now. You get on a diet and change your behavior. There may be some likelihood that that will slow the progression of disease. The data on that are very disappointing. It's hard to find any evidence that doing that will change the future. But certainly we try that in people at a young age who are obviously on a trajectory for a problem in their mid-years. If in fact the disease has already progressed to the point where we think it's advancing, we would probably start drug therapy. And what drugs do we use? Well, drugs that lower cholesterol, the statin drugs that inhibit some of the hormonal systems that raise blood pressure, like the ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, are very valuable. We need better therapy. We need more studies on people with early disease to document how effective we would be in slowing its progression. But there's been no support for this early detection and treatment.
This can be an hour in the Rasmussen
1 hour
clinic.
in the Rasmussen establishes the disease.
And I take it you monitor them over a period of years then.
Well, we ask them to come back if they choose to, and it's up to them, but most of these people do come back regularly, so we're able to track progression of disease. We think that our treatment has markedly slowed it. We think we're doing some good for everybody who goes through the program. Do we have proof of that by long-term outcome data over 40 or 50 years? We do not. Are we keeping people alive until they're 90 or 100, which is my goal? I don't know if we are, but I think we are. We got to prove that.
And most of that is in the new book.
The book basically tracks that, the thought processes that led to where we are today, yes.
Now you, I understand, are a tennis player.
Yeah?
Still to this day,
Yeah?
in your 80s.
That's kind. I'm heading out of my 80s in a couple of years.
Well, and how many times a week do you play tennis?
Well, when I'm in Minneapolis, it's usually once a week. When I'm in Florida, where we spend 6 months a year on Longboat Key, I'm playing 3 times a week.
As you say.
And then I play golf the other days in Florida, so I'm managing
So that
to keep
says
active.
something for the system, at least as far as you are concerned.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I've taken medication that I think is good for your arteries and heart for now about 40 years, and I'm still kicking, so maybe that's a good sign.
Maybe it is, and certainly. Number one, how do people get a hold of the Rasmussen Clinic? Do they call the University of Minnesota?
Well, they call the University of Minnesota. The CSC is our new clinical surgical center, where our Rasmussen Center is located.
You just moved to
Yeah, we've moved
new
to
state-of-the-art.
Our new clinical program at the university has moved on Fulton Street, just a couple of blocks from the hospital. And the Rasmussen Center is where you make an appointment to come in and get that evaluation carried out. It's a 2-hour visit. 1 hour is spent with a incredibly capable nurse practitioner who will take a history and discuss, examine you, discuss your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise, all your risks, and put it all together, and you get a very nice full report afterwards.
And the other hour is the test itself,
The other hour is the testing, right?
which includes, among other things, shooting into the eye to get color from the back of the eye.
Well,
or
we take a picture of the blood vessels in the back of the eye, which are very small arteries that are visible. It's really one of the only places in the body you can visualize the small arteries, and that's why we use the retina as our target. And those pictures actually provide us a good handle on the thickness of the wall of the artery. And as you get hardening of the arteries or atherosclerosis, those little arteries get thicker, and we can see the sign of thickening of the wall, which tells us.
and then you can treat them.
And then, that leads us to use drugs which we know favorably affect the small arteries.
Now, we have the book, Cardiovascular Health, How Conventional Wisdom is Failing Us by Cohn. Where can people get the book?
Well, the book is on Amazon, as are all books. It's published by Rowman and Littlefield, and it can be ordered directly from Rowman and Littlefield or on Amazon. And I'm delighted to hear that the reviews are coming in. This has just been out for a couple weeks now, and the reviews are coming in, and they're obviously impressed some of the reviewers, because the ideas in this book are not commonly being promulgated out in the media. People just don't get this message, and
What about
they need to.
the profession itself?
Well, the profession, there are some reviews on the back cover from my colleagues around the country, and those, in fact, do reflect positive attitudes. It turns out that most physicians, most experts, actually agree with me, but they have never said it in public. And in part because there is hesitancy to actually talk about how diet and exercise aren't necessarily so effective, because that has been the strategy of the Heart Association and the public health agencies, of all aimed at claiming that our whole epidemic of heart disease is because we eat too much and we get overweight. And it may have a little influence, but that's not really true. The reason
So we're talking about the background, the family background, the history, and
the reason in large part why we have an epidemic of cardiovascular disease is that we're living longer. When people died at 45 years old, there was very little cardiovascular disease. Now we have a lot of it. Why? Because life expectancy has gone up into the 80s, and disease has progressed over many, many years. So now we have to keep people alive not until they're 60 or 65, but until they're 90 or 95.
And we've been talking with Dr. Cohn. We have actually run out of time. The new book, Cardiovascular Health, How Conventional Wisdom is Failing Us, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan.